There's something Carl Jung discovered that was never fully revealed. A phenomenon so profound he believed it could change the way we understand love, pain, and the human soul itself. He observed that when an empath is wounded by a narcissist, what's born isn't just a scar. It's what Jung himself called a dangerous transformation. Because something inexplicable happens after the destruction. The mind shatters, the heart collapses, but deep within, a new consciousness begins to emerge. The empath who survives this kind of abuse never returns to who they were. They awaken into a state Jung described as rare and almost impossible to reach. The integration of light and shadow. Few people know what truly happens in this final stage. Some lose their sanity. Others discover a power no one can quite explain. A power that doesn't come from the pain itself, but from what the pain reveals. And maybe you're closer to that than you think. There's something deeply human about wanting to see the good in those who hurt us. You truly believe that person was your cure, the one who would finally bring balance to your inner chaos. Jung said we project onto others what we haven't yet recognized in ourselves. And that's exactly what the empath does. They don't see the narcissist for who they are, but for who they wish someone would be with them. You saw potential, fragility, and light, but it was your own soul's reflection you saw shining back at you. At first, that projection feels almost magical. The narcissist seems tailor-made for your oldest wounds. They understand you, validate you, and wrap you in a mirror of admiration. But slowly, the image starts to crack. The idealization fades, and the empath finds themselves trying to rebuild a paradise that never existed. That's the moment when the other's persona falls, and what appears behind it forces you to face your own shadow. The promise of salvation turns into the bitter memory of misplaced faith. Jung called this the confrontation with the unconscious, the instant when the masks of the soul dissolve and reveal what's been hiding all along. At that point, the empath feels like they've lost everything. But what broke wasn't love. It was the illusion. What dies is the ideal, not your capacity to love. The light you thought had gone out simply returned to where it always belonged, your own center. That's the first initiation of the conscious soul. Realizing the other was never the sun, just a mirror of your inner flame. And it's in that mirror that the shadow reveals itself. The narcissist isn't just the opposite of who you are. They're the unconscious expression of what you've repressed. Jung said everything we deny in ourselves comes back through the destiny of relationships. The narcissist represents your silent hunger to be loved without giving until you're drained. They live out, in distorted form, your repressed desire for freedom. That's why the bond hurts so much. It brutally exposes everything you still haven't learned to integrate. As that awareness matures, anger turns into clarity. You start to see the relationship not as punishment but as a psychological classroom. The wound they opened was the same one you'd been ignoring for years. And here comes the most liberating truth. You were also manipulating with your kindness. You tried to earn love with care, secure safety with overgiving, hide fear behind altruism. It was control disguised as virtue. Realizing this doesn't make you bad. It makes you whole. Because deep down, this encounter was never between two people but between you and your own psyche. Jung said, "No one becomes enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." And that's exactly what happened. The wounded empath dies, and in their place, the conscious individual is born. One who no longer needs to prove their purity just to exist. You're not just a survivor. You're the living symbol of individuation in motion, the gold emerging from fire, now ready to understand the true power of self-knowledge. When the mask falls and the mirror shatters, what's left is silence. And that's where true healing begins. The mind tries to understand, the heart searches for explanations, but the unconscious is already at work. Jung said that suffering is the fire that purifies the soul, and that's exactly what happens when the empath finds themselves alone. What seemed like the end is actually the beginning of the alchemical work, turning pain into awareness, loss into power, and wounds into wisdom. At first, the pain feels unbearable. You wake up in the middle of the night with your chest tight, replaying every word, every gesture that could have changed the outcome. But the unconscious doesn't negotiate with the ego. It destroys what's false to reveal what's real. That's how emotional lead starts turning into psychic gold. The empath who once lived to please begins to strip away the masks that held together the role of healer. And though this unmasking hurts, it's the kind of pain that sets you free. As the suffering deepens, the psyche starts to reorganize itself from within. Dreams turn into messages, symbols replace words. Jung saw this as the natural language of the soul. You might dream of snakes shedding their skin, cracked vases blooming with flowers, or fires leaving behind fertile ground. None of it is random. These are images from the unconscious showing that something inside you is changing shape. The pain isn't breaking you, it's refining you. But alchemy has a second stage, the desert. It's when the empath faces a kind of existential emptiness so deep it's terrifying. No conversation fills it, no distraction soothes it. The ego calls it loneliness, but Jung called it individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are without depending on anyone else's validation. The desert, then, isn't punishment, it's the birthplace of the new self. In the desert, you learn to listen without noise. You discover that silence isn't absence, it's presence. The empath who once lived through others' expectations now starts to feel their own rhythm. Slowly, you realize that solitude is the soul's laboratory. It's where the self rebuilds, not as someone's reflection, but as authentic essence. The desert teaches you, firmly, that the source was never in someone else's oasis. It was always the hidden spring within you. And when that spring awakens, everything changes. The same situations that once broke you now teach you. Pain becomes your compass. Emptiness becomes your shelter. Jung said, "What a man needs for his happiness is inner transformation." And that's what happens here. The empath stops being a hostage to their wound and becomes the alchemist of their own consciousness. The one who once begged for love now learns to generate light from their own darkness. And that's the moment when the true journey begins to unfold. When the empath finally finds peace in silence, something unexpected happens. In the same place where pain once lived, a new kind of discomfort appears, the inner mirror. It's in that moment that you start to see something that was always there, though you never wanted to admit it. Part of your light was also a mask. Jung said the shadow isn't the bad in us. It's what's been repressed in the name of an ideal image. And that's one of the hardest truths to face, realizing that behind your kindness, there was also control. You start noticing that many times you helped not just out of compassion, but out of fear of being forgotten. Being the healer gave your life meaning. While healing others, you felt needed, valuable, loved. Jung called this identification with the martyr archetype. The belief that suffering is a virtue, that giving yourself away is the same as loving. But the unconscious, both wise and ruthless, doesn't tolerate masks for long. It pushes you to see how much of your pain was vanity disguised as altruism. That realization hits like lightning in the desert. It hurts to admit that part of your purity was a defense, an unconscious way to manipulate the world into giving you worth. You believed that if you were good enough, abandonment would be impossible. And without realizing it, you traded authenticity for acceptance. But every soul reaches a moment when it must choose between being loved and being whole. That's where individuation truly begins, when you accept that even your light needs purification. Integrating this shadow isn't about guilt, it's about understanding. It means seeing that your urge to heal came from a genuine place, but it was mixed with a need for control. Jung said consciousness arises when the opposite is recognized. In other words, the true empath is born when they realize they can also be narcissistic, and that narcissism isn't a monster, but an energy that, when balanced, turns into self-worth. Healing, then, is simply the art of harmonizing polarities. Over time, you learn to look at yourself with less judgment and more honesty. Repressed anger starts to make sense. The need to please loses its grip, and the old role of the wounded saint becomes too small to contain you. You stop seeing yourself as a victim and start understanding yourself as a student. Because deep down, the empath and the narcissist aren't enemies. They're parts of the same psyche seeking balance. Light without shadow is illusion. Shadow without light is destruction. The real power lies in the middle, and when this integration finally happens, something changes in your eyes. You no longer need to prove that you're good. Purity stops being performance and becomes presence. The mature empath no longer heals out of need, they heal out of understanding. They don't save anyone. They simply illuminate the path through their own example. That's when the gold of consciousness begins to shine effortlessly, and the journey enters a new phase, the rebuilding of authentic bonds, free from guilt, fear, and dependency. When you finally face your own shadow and stop running from it, something shifts in how you see the past. The narcissist, who once seemed like the absolute villain of your story, starts to take on a different meaning. Jung said the unconscious speaks through symbols and characters, and some of them enter our lives only to push us to the threshold of awareness. The narcissist was exactly that, the trigger for your awakening. They were the cocoon that forced you to shed your old skin. It's strange to think that someone who hurt you so deeply could have played a sacred role. But that's how the unconscious works, through paradoxes. Jung called it enantiodromia, the moment when opposites turn into each other. Destruction becomes birth, pain becomes wisdom. You begin to see that the suffering wasn't punishment. It was initiation. Just as gold needs fire, the soul needs loss to become lucid. The empath who once begged for love now learns to generate light from their own chaos. This journey echoes through every ancient myth. Orpheus descended into the underworld to find Eurydice and returned transformed by sorrow. Inanna, the Sumerian goddess, had her garments stripped away one by one before being reborn as a queen. Christ descended into darkness before rising in glory. All of them embody the same archetype, the passage through the inner hell as part of the soul's evolution. You too have crossed your inferno, and now you understand it was the path, not the punishment. The empath is reborn, but not the same. The old sweetness gives way to a quiet strength. You don't lose your sensitivity, you gain structure. Compassion stops being weakness and becomes discernment. Jung would say individuation has reached balance. The shadow has been integrated, the persona dissolved, and the self has begun to emerge. Now your light doesn't reflect anyone. It radiates from within. That's the difference between the mirror and the flame. And perhaps the most beautiful part is realizing that, deep down, nothing was in vain. Every tear, every silence, Every sleepless night of confusion was a soul lesson in boundaries, love, and truth. The narcissist was only the instrument. The orchestra was within you all along. Suffering broke you apart, but self-knowledge rebuilt you in wider proportions. You became the alchemist of your own pain, turning poison into medicine. Now the empath is no longer a reflection of the world. They are the source. The light no longer comes from others' recognition but from inner clarity. The wound no longer dictates the rhythm, the heart does. What once was a battlefield has become a temple. You look back and understand that nothing was lost, only what couldn't follow you into the next stage of the journey. And from this point of awareness, the true power begins. Living with lucidity without needing to prove anything to anyone. After the storm passes, silence no longer hurts. It blooms. There comes a moment when you realize something inside you has quietly rearranged itself, as if a new order were sprouting from the ashes of the old chaos. The same soil that once held pain now gives birth to a garden. Jung said that when consciousness expands, the unconscious becomes a creative ally. And that's exactly what you feel now. A calm yet steady force pushing you to express what you've learned. To write, to paint, to teach, to inspire. The pain that once paralyzed you now becomes movement. Each memory stops being a wound and turns into a tool. You no longer speak to be heard. You speak because you overflow. That's the difference between the wounded empath and the healed one. The first gives out of need, the second out of abundance. Your presence becomes your language. People feel your energy before you say a word, because what radiates from you now isn't longing, it's serenity. This new stage is what Jung called anchoring in the self, the central point of the psyche, where opposites coexist in harmony. Before, you acted from an ideal, trying to be the savior or the saint. Now, you act from wholeness. A human being who feels, makes mistakes, loves, and forgives without needing to be perfect. Your giving comes from awareness, not guilt. You heal others not by fixing them, but simply by being what you are, whole. But wholeness comes with a paradox. You're strong and vulnerable at the same time. Firm enough to set boundaries, yet sensitive enough to keep your heart open. Jung saw this integration as the true sign of spiritual maturity, living the paradox of the soul without needing to solve the mystery. The mature empath understands they are not light all the time, nor shadow all the time. They are the space where both dance in balance. For Jung, the symbol of the self was the mandala, a serene center surrounded by opposites in constant motion. That's the feeling that begins to take root in your chest. That even when the world spins, there's a point within you that stays still. You no longer need to run from the shadow or worship the light. You learn to dwell in the middle, where truth exists without labels. Peace stops being the absence of conflict and becomes the presence of awareness. And in this state, everything you touch transforms. You no longer search for meaning, you embody it. The empath who was once a prisoner of love now becomes its channel. Suffering turned into fertile soil, and from the ruins grew the garden of wisdom. This is the culmination of the Jungian journey. The ego has stopped fighting the unconscious and begun to converse with it. And when that happens, you don't just live, you bloom. At the end of the journey, you realize nothing was ever truly lost. The destruction was only the dismantling of illusions that kept you away from yourself. Jung said the self, the center of the psyche, never disappears. It merely hides beneath the masks we create to survive. When those masks fall, what remains isn't emptiness, it's presence. And it's in that presence that the empath awakens to their true nature. Now, you no longer live for others, you live from your inner axis. The pains that once broke you have become silent compasses pointing toward awareness. Compassion remains, but it's now paired with boundaries. Sensitivity stays, but it's transformed into discernment. You no longer confuse love with salvation. You understand that to love is to see clearly and stay whole. This is the revelation Jung considered dangerous. The power was within you all along. The narcissist was never the thief of your light, only the mirror that reminded you where it was hidden. Everything that seemed lost was just projection. The strength you sought outside was the same one that had been sustaining your soul from within. The matured empath no longer seeks redemption, they embody it. Once consciousness awakens, it never falls back asleep. That's why the end isn't really an ending. It's a return to the center. The empath doesn't become someone else, they become whole. The love that once begged now overflows. The shadow once feared now protects. And life, which once looked like ruins, reveals itself as the very architecture of the soul. And when that understanding finally settles in, everything becomes clear. What was taken was only illusion. What remains is the indestructible within you. If this video spoke to your soul, leave a like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to keep walking this path of self-discovery. And when you finish here, stay with me for the next video. Your evolution has just begun.